Hello and welcome to Faithful Footsteps. If you're new here, I'm Ben, and I'm glad you're joining us. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about my journey. I guess you could call it my faith journey or my Christian journey or my walk with Christ. We all call it by different things, but my journey really started out probably like a lot of young boys, kids did. I grew up in the church. I attended church with my parents. We went to the Nazarene Church in Hutchinson, Kansas. And really from when I was 5 years old, I felt like we were in church every Sunday, every Wednesday. Every time the doors were open, we were there. And I think that's a lot of people's stories. And I just remember, a good Christian upbringing. My parents both were very faithful. They talked about Christ. We prayed at every meal. And so for me, I had this upbringing of Christianity, so much so that the school that I went to from when I was in 4th grade all the way until I was in 10th grade was a Christian school. And, we had Bible classes and we learned memory, scripture and memorization. And so I had this firm and solid background of going to church, being a Christian. But my real journey started when I was 16 years old. And when I was 16 years old, I remember my parents sat my brother and I down. We were both 16 at the time, and they told us we were moving. And we had grown up in Kansas. We had spent almost 12 years of our lives there, and it just came as a huge shock. And they had made the decision for the family to move us to Oklahoma, where my grandparents lived. My sister was going to attend college. And as a 16-year-old kid, my world was shook. It was broken apart. I had a girlfriend, I had friends, I played soccer and basketball, and I was active, and I was a very, popular, if you want to use that word, kid. I loved to hang out with other people at their houses, and my whole world just imploded in that moment. And I remember just the fight and the horror of having to move my whole life, and I couldn't process that. And that didn't change anything though. So at 16, between my sophomore and junior year of high school, we moved from Kansas to Oklahoma. And the transition for me was very difficult, very challenging. I just didn't find a place like I had found in Kansas growing up. Couldn't play soccer anymore. Wasn't really interested in school, though I never had been, to be fair. And that's when my life kind of started to teeter. And I remember my parents, they started to struggle as well. They couldn't find a church that they had liked as well as the Nazarene church that we'd grown up in, and it was just an awkward time for us. And I remember at this time we really kind of stopped going to church as a family. And I think that was the start of a different journey for me. At the same time, 16 years old, new school, new home, new state, new friends, new environment, I started to also struggle with depression. And I think there's a lot of things that went into me feeling depressed, and I won't get into all of them here, but there was just all of these overwhelming things that were going on in my life, things I had also begun to learn, things that I hadn't known from when I was a kid, and it just started to really tear me apart. And I remember this is, the mid-2000s, and I remember when I started to feel depressed, I went and talked to my parents, and it was such a different time then. And I remember my parents saying to me, well, maybe you're just sad, or, it's been a hard move, things have been difficult. And I think that in their minds made sense. And I think for a lot of parents, they could never have fathomed what was going on in my brain, what was going on in my mind. And mental illness and depression and anxiety were very different in those days. Even though that was just 15 years ago, 16 years ago, it was a different time, and it wasn't as well known or well understood, and they did the best they could for me. So from about 16 years old all the way until I graduated high school, I was just wrestling and struggling with depression. And when 2009 came, when I graduated, just everything that could go wrong went wrong. I had had plans and for my life that I would maybe not skip college, but go to a community college and move into an apartment by myself and do some work and do some college. And, I kind of had this support from my mom and my dad that this would be a good idea. And then the stock market crashed and everything went under and we kind of lost everything as a family. And I was left just out on my own. It wasn't by any fault of my family's. It was just we have to figure things out. And so I made the decision to go to college, the same college my sister had gone to, and just kind of follow in her footsteps, even though I wasn't sold on college. I'd never been a good student, never enjoyed school. And so I went to college, and for the first semester, things went really good, as new environments tend to do for people who struggle with depression. I got new friends, was having fun, enjoying life. It was just this time that was very enjoyable. I went to my classes, was getting pretty decent grades. But around Christmas of that year, my first semester of college, my depression really came back full force, probably stronger than it had ever been. And I remember at that point, I just could no longer find the will to do the things that the other kids were doing. I didn't want to go to sporting events. I didn't want to get out of my room or in my bed. I didn't go to my classes. I just didn't want to be social at all. I would just pretty much stay with the same group of 6 to 7 guys and play video games, go to meals, and I began to really unravel. I started failing my classes and everything just fell apart for me, and I eventually ended up failing out of my semester, and the college was left with this hard choice to just tell me, we can't have you come back. And I was back in this transition period. I'm struggling with depression, not knowing where to go, what to do, and so I made the decision that I would move back to Kansas on my own and hopefully pick back up my life where I had lost it 3 years prior when we had moved as a family. So I moved back to Kansas, and I got a job and reconnected with my old girlfriend and tried to reconnect with my old friends. And again, at first, the move was great. It was a temporary lift, a temporary boost. Things seemed good, seemed right, seemed fixed even. And then it got worse. I found out that the friends that I once had in high school had moved on with their lives. They had gone on to college and gone on to other things. And I just realized I was, for the most part, alone, other than my then girlfriend to soon-to-be fiance and her family. And so I started to connect with the people that I had access to. And unfortunately, the people I had access to were the people I worked with. And they were older than me, and they had had more exposure to life than me, if you want to say that. And so my schedule became pretty simple. Every day I would work from 3 to 11 p.m.-ish, 11:30-ish, and I'd get off work and I would go tell my fiance good night, tell her I was going home. Ultimately, I was lying, and I would go out to a party and I would drink and smoke weed and smoke cigarettes and do whatever the kids were doing and whatever the older people could buy me, and it became an everyday habit. And meanwhile, my life was unraveling. I wasn't taking my depression medicine. I wasn't going to church. I'd actually rearranged my schedule so that I could skip church and have the excuse that my job was the reason. And my life was just getting worse and worse and worse. And this went on for almost 2 months. And things were starting to fall apart and people were starting to recognize it. But me, in this state of depression, could not see that. I couldn't see how people would know that. I thought I was fooling the world, and I thought people wouldn't find me out, and I thought, nothing was going to go wrong, and it was going to be okay. And I remember for about the last month, this is December 2011, I remember just struggling. I remember some days I would text my boss, be laying in bed, text my boss in the morning and say, I can't make it in today. I have a migraine, or I have a I have a headache or I feel sick or whatever the excuse I could come up with at that time, I would always have some reason why I couldn't go to work. And then I remember they would turn into 2, 3 days, 4 days where I just wouldn't show up to work. And quite honestly, I'm not sure how I had a job anymore. And I remember I was distancing myself from people who cared for me, people who wanted the best for me, my friends, my family, my loved ones. And I was drinking more, and I was smoking more, and I was just genuinely trying to self-medicate the depression that I felt, the struggle that I felt. And then in December, I went to visit my parents. And I remember waking up from a text message from my roommate. And he said, I found your alcohol. And at the time, I look back now and see how concerned he must have been. I was 19, 20 years old, hiding alcohol in my apartment between pizza boxes in the freezer and underneath our sink in a cubby hole. And I look back now and think how concerned he must have been. But I remember at the time being so angry that he had gone and told my fiance and told the family and told my parents, I think, and I was just so angry, and I was so tired of being around these people and tired of my life and tired of the same thing over and over, going to a retail job and just hating everything I was about, hating everything that was going on. And I hadn't picked up a Bible in months and hadn't gone to church in months, and life was just getting worse and worse and worse. And so in January 2011, I again went to visit my parents, and I remember I was absolutely at the lowest point in my life I had ever been. And I had been depressed now for almost 4 years, but I never felt this way, never felt so lost, never felt so unhappy. And so in January 2011, I went to visit my parents. I don't know how many days I was there, because for the most part all of this seems much like a blur, or much like somebody took an eraser and erased a portion of my life, sections of it. Like I have fleeting memories, and they're now gone almost. But I remember I stayed with them a few days, and I got up one morning, got my stuff ready to go back to my house. I lived about an hour away from them in Hutchinson, Kansas. They lived in Derby. And I remember packing my car up, getting in the car and driving off. And as I was driving the way home, I just remember this overwhelming darkness, this crushing feeling. And I just thought to myself, I can't do this anymore. I can't live like this anymore. And I was this young kid, 20 years old. I had my whole life ahead of me. I had a somewhat decent job. I was engaged to be married like 6 months after this. Life was, for all accounts, should have been great, but I just remember thinking, it's not worth it anymore. I cannot do this. And so, January 15th, 2011, I thought to myself, I can't do life anymore. And on my drive home, I remember thinking, it's time for me to commit suicide. And so, as I was driving home 75 miles an hour down the highway, I looked off in the distance, and I saw a large pole, and I said, this will be the end of me. And I let my tires cruise over the rumble strips and hit the grass.